Our human brains are pretty fallible. We actually suck a lot of the time at creative things. AI does not have that problem. A good idea is something that can survive bad writing, but the inverse of that is never true. One of the most useful tools I've ever found for writing introductions is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. I almost think about this kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of editing. It's basically the process of trying to articulate the opposition's viewpoint as clearly and eloquently as you possibly can. The bottom end of SEO content is something that historically was not very fun and not very skilled. It's going to become AI. We're going to have to focus our energy on higher leverage stuff, coming up with contrarian ideas that reflect the nature of our world. There is so much more to the performance of an article than just the words on the page. Technology is basically indistinguishable from magic. This stuff is going to radically change how our industry functions and how we write stuff.
Ryan, tell us a little bit about your content marketing philosophy and how it has evolved over time.
I would love to. Uh, Probably one of like the biggest shifts in my thinking has I tend to talk about it as like the primacy of good ideas, because I come very much from this like old school world of SEO content where everything I ever wrote was basically designed to target a keyword, and that was like my entire way I thought of content was within the box of SEO. And I joined Animalz, and at that time, like 4.5 years ago, they didn't even do SEO for the most part. They had all this amazing success, all these amazing customers, and it was all predicated on just like interesting content, good ideas, novel articulations of ideas. And it blew my mind. Like the fact that you could create content and get good results from it without SEO even entering into the equation. So like the last few years at Animalz, I've been exploring that a little bit more and kind of come to the conclusion that basically a good idea is something that can survive bad writing, but the inverse of that is never true. Like you can't write your way around a terrible idea. So actually a lot of what I try and do and what a lot of I try and help other people do is to improve their process for having better ideas. So right at that very starting point of the content marketing workflow, focusing in on that part of it, the ideation, the coming up with topics in the first place, because content marketing is laden with processes and tools and tactics, and they're almost all focused on the writing and onwards portion, and we just haven't applied the same rigor to ideation and coming up with those sorts of ideas. So yeah, that's a huge part of like how I think about content is, can we make the core idea better? And if we do that, we probably don't need to worry about the other things like writing and distribution quite as much, because the idea will carry the day a little bit.
I think that's fantastic. And one thing that I want to ask you about that too is let's talk about the idea of applying pressure to ideas. How has your philosophy on that evolved over time? Because obviously, like, I think a lot of us start in that SEO, going after the keywords. Like, that's most people's entry point. But from a philosophical standpoint, how has that sort of looked for you where you've changed your mindset around that and then applying pressure to those ideas to make better ideas, put those out into the market?
I came across this idea which is like lodged in my head ever since, and it's, you've probably heard of like straw manning an argument. So it's like this classic rhetorical device where if you don't want to, if it's not a favorable argument, if you don't think you're going to win, you can kind of shift the goalposts and erect a straw man, like a stand-in argument that isn't actually the thing you're talking about, but it lets you kind of win the argument. And the opposite of that, people refer to as steel manning. I love it. It's basically the process of trying to articulate the opposition's viewpoint as strongly and clearly and eloquently as you possibly can. And when I came across that, I realized that like that is basically the function of writing. That is how you make good persuasive writing. That is how you share good ideas. You have to inhabit the role of a very critical reader every time you're writing something. You have to try holes in it wherever you can. You have to be so brutally self-critical with what you're writing, because if you don't do that, the reader will do it for you. And because of the kind of asynchronous nature of reading and writing, you have no recourse at that point. You can't preempt their questions. You can't answer it for them. So that is basically my writing process, is like, here's an interesting idea. Let's absolutely beat the living daylight out of it to find out the 8,000 ways it doesn't make sense and it's stupid. And the process of doing that is generally how you reach something that is yeah, a bit more valid, a bit closer to reality, and a bit more helpful, I think.
How are you going about applying pressure to those ideas?
I think probably looking for real world examples. So it's quite easy to come up with like nice intellectual arguments that sound good in practice, but I think they're kind of empty if you then can't map it back to somebody in the real world that has actually used that to good effect and had good results from it. Um, I guess related to that as well, like edge cases. Um, I'm a big fan of using like the rule of three in writing. So anytime you make a point or you use an example, don't just do one, do it three times, because you're kind of proving that your argument is not reliant on a single edge case, some like freak of nature, some fluke event. You're proving that you have like a whole body of things that validate what you're saying. So yeah, I spend a lot of time just reading back the things I've read, the ideas I've had, and trying to say like, how do I know this to be true just beyond it like feeling satisfying in my head, which is not always a good indicator of actual validity.
So here's something I'm curious about too, because I don't say this like I'm not trying to butter you up or anything, but you are one of the people that I would consider a thought leader in this space, and I mean that in like the most non-cringy way possible. Like literally, your thoughts are leading the industry. How are you balancing that unproven territory with the stuff where it's like, oh, well, this is a little bit more tried and true, like attaching those two things where your thoughts do seem practical, even if there's not a lot to back it up out there in the market.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I always get that right either. I think the reason people like Animalz and the blog is because we we basically chosen to focus on like the interesting stuff. And I'm a big believer that we're part of this kind of collaborative ecosystem of content. Like enough people have been writing about content marketing that most parts of it have been covered pretty well by someone somewhere. So we basically try not to focus on the stuff that like Moz or Ahrefs have done a fantastic job, because what more could we add? So we're always looking for like the edge cases, the more advanced, uh, maybe hypothetical, interesting things that may come to fruition and may provide some leverage. But there's obviously this balancing act there where sometimes the simple things are just the thing you should be doing, and actually sharing all these amazing fancy ideas can be a distraction from just showing up, publishing more, targeting more keywords, just being more consistent. So I think actually, like, I like some of the feedback like readers share. I had this great response to this article I published the other week from John Henry Shirk, I think his name is. Lovely guy, amazing like content marketer, and he shared a really like articulate, erudite pushback against the article I'd written, and it was like bang on. Like I completely agreed with it. He was basically arguing that it's risky to explore future states and assume that Google is going to adopt all the patents it does, blah blah blah. I think that that's probably like just at the sweet spot of what we aim for. Like we want to be interesting enough that there's potentially leverage there that people can do something that hasn't been done 1,000 times, but we don't want to get into the realms of like abstract ideas that have no bearing on reality.
So this is going to seem a bit of a weird segue, but like, how is AI playing a role in any of this, or is AI playing a role in any of this, or where do you see it fitting in with the bigger picture these days?
And I'm trying to work that out for myself, because I remember I used GPT-3 for the very first time back in like May of 2020, because Andrew, who's our amazing head of R&D, showed me how to play with the API despite my lack of knowledge. And it just blew me away. There's this, I can't remember, this really famous quote about, technology is basically indistinguishable from magic in certain cases. And this was the first time I actually felt that was true, because my entire career has been predicated on my ability to write well. And I
Right.
put I put the first chapter, the first like intro paragraph from the first book of the Green Priest into GPT-3 to see what it would do with it. And the content it spat back was like really good, like interesting. It was like beautifully written as well. And it made me think that as much as we probably don't want to admit it, and as much as we thought creative processes would be immune from being disrupted by AI, this stuff is going to radically change how our industry functions and how we write stuff. Like I don't see any other end result from that. So the thing I'm thinking about at the moment is, where is this going to like broach first? When are we going to feel the impact of this first? I think my money's probably on simple SEO content. So stuff like listicles, how to's, what is articles. This is stuff that doesn't have like a hugely complicated narrative structure. And in a lot of cases, the subject matter we're writing about is very well represented in GPT-3's data set. So it knows a lot about it.
Right.
And that basically means you can very, very easily bootstrap a functional article. Like some stuff I've been doing, I've been writing about like 20 best zombie books, for example. And all you're doing, you're basically just describing the plot of a book that is vaguely relevant. And AI can do that so well. And it's basically, I think, rendering this entire portion of content marketing something that historically was not very fun and not very skilled. That's something AI can probably do pretty much as well as most human writers are going to do. So my money is that the bottom end of SEO content is going to become AI by like default, and we're going to have to focus our energy on higher leverage stuff and the things that AI can't do, like interviewing and narrative structure and coming up with contrarian ideas that reflect the nature of our world.
What I think is interesting about this is that what the Animals as a publication does, what Animals as a company does, is really brings that heart and soul out of a company into the content that's being created. And what the AI is doing right now is the opposite of that. It's giving you the sort of basic framework. What I think is great about that, it allows you to take these ideas that can only be yours and bring it to the ideation phase of what we were talking about before, and make it so that helps and assists with the process, but not overtake it entirely. Can you talk about that maybe a little bit more?
Like writing is obviously it's an inherently creative thing, especially when you do the kind of writing that we try and do on the Animals blog, where you're not even writing to keywords, you're just coming up with ideas. But actually, our human brains are pretty fallible, and like we actually suck quite a lot of the time at lots of creative things. A great example of this, I love talking about blog post titles. So I'm a big believer. It's something actually that Jimmy Daly instilled in me. The more blog post titles you write, the better the chances you have of landing on one that's actually going to be interesting, good, novel, differentiated. So I routinely ask people to say like, write 20 titles and come back to me, and we'll pick the best one. And what always happened to me as well, is you come up with maybe two or three that are actually different, and then you create like 17 or 18 variations of whichever one you have already decided in your head is the best. It's very hard to break out of that mental rut and come up with stuff that is actually different. And AI does not have that same problem. It does not have those same human biases. So if you ask an AI to come up with 20 different titles for your blog post, it's going to come up with 20 different titles. And I think you can kind of apply that to lots of different creative processes. I, I love this quote from one of my favorite books. It's like where good ideas come from. And it's something along the lines of the goal of like creativity is basically just to get more pieces on the table to play with. And AI is really good at bringing more pieces onto your table and giving you more stuff to play with and pick and choose from.
Okay, so let's bring this into the next section of the show where we talk about process. Tell me a little bit about your process from ideation to publishing. Where is AI playing a role in that nowadays, especially in helping you find a solid premise? Well, let's walk through all that.
So the my ideation process for like the Animalz blog, for example, was super different to how I used to approach content, because I used to be like a very rigid, calendar oriented, like here is your 6 month content calendar, and like come hell or high water, we're going to publish all of these exactly when I say we're going to do it. And as soon as I tried to bring that energy to the Animalz blog and write thought leadership, it just totally fell apart. It was so hard to reconcile a kind of creative thinking that you needed to come up with the ideas that we write about with that kind of rigidity and that schedule. So now I'm much, much more fluid in terms of how I think about like process for planning content. Um, we were talking a bit about this yesterday, actually, Tommy. Like, what are the Pareto principles of like ideation and creativity? And I basically come to the idea that you need to have one place where you put every single idea that leaves your brain, regardless of whether you think it's good or bad. And then you have to come back to it and make time to review and process and look for like commonalities between ideas, ask what would happen if you smush them together and come up with a new idea as a result of it. So a big part of what I do is just I read a ton of stuff, I write down my reactions to it, the questions that it leads me with, And I try and make time every single week to come back to that list of ideas and say, like, what am I still interested in? Which of these is the most like pressing problem that people are experiencing right now? What am I most excited to write? And the thing that I normally find is that the best articles we end up publishing are the ones that probably were like 3 or 4 different ideas. And I've, through playing with them and writing scrappy bits of them, I realized there's some bigger narrative that kind of sits above all of it. And I guess interesting, that's kind of a parallel to how I think about writing fiction as well. For me, a book is basically a collection of individual satisfying scenes. So before I didn't know how to write a book. It was this huge, terrifying thing. So I just wrote some short stories. And I looked back at the commonalities and the themes and the character development that was the same between all of them, and realized that, hey, there's this bigger story that could connect all of them together. So yeah, that's fundamentally how I think about process for planning content for Animalz. In terms of AI, like, it's not really a part of that process yet. I'm trying to work out what that looks like. I've
Okay.
been writing articles with AI, like SEO stuff, like from scratch, to see what that's like. And I've been using it for things like title generation, but I've not brought it into the like, what ideas can we have phase yet. I think that's something that's definitely worth exploring.
One of the articles that you've written that I reference quite a bit is the second mover advantage article, right? In which you talk about looking at Google is like looking into the night sky, and the light that you're seeing is from billions of years ago, and that's kind of what search results are like right now. I love it. It's brilliant. I've claimed it as my own in so many ways. What does that look like when you're going from, if you come up with that, are you drilling, like, how is that kind of playing into the rest of the process, I guess? Like, are you jumping off of that as an idea and then building off more ideas, or what does that look like?
One of the things I love about the Animalz blog is I noticed this first with Jimmy's stuff, because obviously the first thing I did when I took over was I read everything he'd ever written on there. And you see this like geological record of ideas evolving over time. And normally the really like uncannily smart and prescient and pithy article he wrote was preceded by like 2 or 3 slightly different articulations that skirted around that idea a little bit. So that article in particular was actually like 2 less good articles to begin with, one of which was all about HubSpot and HubSpot's content marketing and why I didn't think it was very good today, used to be very good. And another one about the idea of like, you don't have to be the first, you can be the second, and you can embrace that. And through the process of writing both of those, I realized it was the same narrative. That was the same thing I was looking at from 2 different perspectives. So in that way as well, like that article then becomes like a data point that feeds into future stuff. Because a lot of stuff I've written about, like information gain and the fallibility of Google search results, they're all building on those same few ideas. They're all just like the next level of that, or thinking about how you apply that idea in a slightly different context. They're basically, I think they're all part of the same bigger overarching narrative. And it's quite a fun, satisfying way to write. Like, you're kind of bootstrapping off your own previous ideas to come up with new stuff.
What I think is great about that too is, especially where, as it relates specifically to second mover advantage, but more broadly to the conversation, is that there are so many different people in the space, and everybody's saying a lot of the same stuff nowadays. Uh, and what you're able to do with this idea of second mover advantage, using HubSpot as a great example of this, is taking what they've already done and doing exactly the opposite of what they're doing, which I would say the Animalz blog and a lot of what that work is centered around is exactly that, right? You see what everybody else is doing, do what nobody else is doing, and then you've carved out a little spot for yourself. So, yeah. All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about your process. So you've gotten past the ideation phase. You know you've got some good ideas. What's next?
I will try and write a first draft. I'm the kind of person that I just like to sit down and write an entire article and like not think too much about it. And it's kind of interesting because we have like a very rigorous editing process at Animalz that all articles go through. And what I realized personally as I was doing this was that I didn't find it hugely helpful for the stuff I was writing for our blog, because a lot of it was focused on basically we assume that the idea is valid, and then we look at how we can articulate that idea in the best possible way. And that wasn't really the input I wanted and found helpful. So what I would typically do then is find people at Animalz, or even people like in our wider network, that I think could add something to this or could beat the idea up or just like chat through it. And like all the editing part of it from this perspective was always focused on the idea. Is like, this idea worth pursuing? What questions does this leave you with? How credible do you find this?
I'm going to actually stop you right there. How are you validating those ideas?
Uh Good question. I mean, uh well, so part of it comes from like where the source of it, for like one point of view. So one of the things Jimmy always talked about was the best source of stuff to write about is the problems like prospects and customers are solving. So if you have somebody talking about a problem 10 times or 10 customers mention it, that to my mind is pre-validated. So like that is a problem that is worth solving. That's good. I guess in terms of like something that's a bit more like nebulous, like some of the articles we've written, it's maybe do other people that are smarter than me, do they understand more of the world than they did previous to reading the thing I just wrote about? um there's this idea of like we're trying to draw like concrete lines around really nebulous things. Like the best articles, you read them and you go, oh, I didn't know that was the name of that thing. Like you've had the experience, you recognize it. And that's really easy, like that's really obvious in hindsight. That's a really hard thing to do, because you're basically trying to synthesize all these different data points, things you've seen in the world, and tie it into a coherent narrative. But if you can do that, if somebody reads that and they go like, ah, that's exactly the thing I didn't know I needed a name for, that is probably like the best way to validate that idea, I think.
Yeah, cool. All right, so you've validated the idea, you've developed the idea, you've validated the idea. Let's go forward. You personally, it sounds like you're not an outliner.
Yeah, I'm a huge advocate of outlining, actually, like
Oh,
big
you
time.
are? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely am. Like everything I do. I mean, so you got a sneak preview of the notes I took for this
Yeah.
session now. I did an outline for this session. Like that's just how my brain operates. And yeah, I can either sometimes I'll get input on the outline, or sometimes the outline is just for me, and that's from me structuring my idea, and then I turn that into a first draft. That's normally like part of that process. But always outline. Big advocate of always outlining, because you it's much easier to see when things are going to go off the rails, or when ideas are kind of unevenly weighted, when you're looking at like 100 words instead of 1,000 words. So big
Mhm.
fan of doing that. Um, One of the parts of our process that I think is really important is then trying to articulate whatever core concept, and we should really only be talking about one core idea in every article. Is there a way we can represent that visually? Because I think that is a really useful exercise to kind of refine your clarity in your thinking, and it's also a great way to improve the spread of this idea. If you have an image that articulates everything you want to get across in this article, that is a really powerful, potent thing to do. So I'm a big advocate of trying to do that.
All right, let's move on to the next section. You've validated the idea, you've come up with all of this, the piece is written. Tell me about your pregame before you edit.
Yeah, so like context acquisition is probably like the most important thing to do. There is so much more to the performance of an article than just the words on the page. That is part of it, but that is not all of it. And to have any idea of whether this is going to be good and useful to you, you have to understand the broader context it exists in. So why is this article created? What is the intended distribution method? What is the biggest strategy it fits into? What are the desirable outcomes you want of this? And who is the reader? All of those, they are necessary bits of information to work out whether this thing is going to be good and do the thing you hope it will. Because a lot of times, line edits, they won't materially impact lots of those really important criteria. I almost think about this kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of editing. There's no point doing line edits if you are writing an SEO article and you've completely botched the search intent, and like it's never going to match that in a million years. You have to understand that stuff before you move on to the more like detailed, granular edits. Always try and read it through end to end as well, because I find it very hard to do, but I know it's really like unfair to the reader to jump in and immediately leave edits when you've not taken the time to read the whole thing and digested it as a whole. So I always try and do that. And then probably lastly, like be a bit pragmatic and work out, are we do we have time for developmental editing? Is this something that we can take our time over and test the fundamental thesis? Or is this something that we just have to get live and our job is to make it the best possible version of whatever it is now? Because there's so many ways you can edit, so many ways to be useful and to try and improve content. You do have to bound the scope of how you're going to wade into the fray, I think.
I was talking with Emily Triplet Lentz over at Calendly a few shows ago, and one of the things she had said was exactly what you were talking about. Is it even doing what it is that we're trying to do? And she says, I won't even do any line edits if the idea itself isn't great. So if it clearly missed the mark. So she'll get on a Loom video to walk through it, to do those developmental things, because it's not even worth the time as an editor to like spend that much time in there if it just doesn't hit the mark right away. Well, let's break into the second half. Let's jump into the live edit itself. All right. First impression of the article. What did you think before you started jumping into it?
Yeah, I thought it's a good article. Like, I think you've done, I think, the very smart thing of picking an article where there's nothing obviously wrong with it. Like, I think if you publish this as is, it would do a good job at the intended goal. But I like that you've done that, because actually that is quite often how I try and edit stuff at Animalz, because we are very lucky to work with very good writers. So yeah, I was actually impressed with it. Very broad brush. I'd say it's probably a little bit too long, but I do have a suggestion about how we could solve that and make it a little bit stronger in the process. But yeah, generally very impressed with this. I think good job to the person that created this. I guess I will start from the top, where most people would start, I imagine. So this is obviously this is the title, and potentially this is an SEO targeted article that kind of reeks of keyword to me. And I'm never going to be annoyed at somebody for including a keyword verbatim in the article title. I think that's like a great thing to do. Maybe the first area where I start to think we could maybe make a couple of changes is just the without bias thing. So when you read the article, it makes a very convincing point that when you buy a piece of software, your bias can creep into it, and that can negatively impact the outcome of doing so. The problem is, I feel like this is almost a bit of an unknown to the reader. Even if people are struggling with the problem of bias in their software decisions, they're probably not going to know that that's a thing. So actually including this as the title, as the main intro hook, you've almost lost me a little bit, because even if this is affecting me, I don't know, I wouldn't recognize it in these terms. So there's not much compelling me to actually click through there. So potentially like some way of reframing that around a different problem. I think as well, like I'm also a big fan, if you're going to add a template, which is a bit of extra value add, tell people you're going to do it. The only issue here is that if I was doing this, I'd probably do it with an article that was like, here's an applicant tracking system, like spreadsheet with template. So immediately what the template is about. Whereas with this, there's nothing in the title that tells me what the template is actually of. We find out later on, but that right from the get-go, that's kind of lost me again a little bit, because what is the template that's on offer here? Now, introductions. I spend a lot of time on intros because most people get bored of reading whatever you write the longer they get into it. So obviously they're very, very important. I think opening with a stat is it's a pretty classic content marketing thing to do. And I think it used to be, and sometimes can be, a good way of getting people's attention. I'm a massive skeptic of doing it, though, for a couple of reasons. I think it's very overdone at this point, to the extent of it's no longer a pattern interrupt. It's just something that people expect. So it almost has the inverse effect to what we want it to have these days. And I think we're kind of delegating away our authority as the writer right from the get-go, because we're basically saying hey, this is an article that I've written. It's really worthwhile. You should pay attention to what I have to say. Oh, but by the way, immediately I'm predicating my argument on the work of somebody else, linking out to Chief Martech, linking out to the sales technology landscape. And that may not feel like a particularly important thing, but I think that does actually have a big impact on credibility, like the credibility of you as an expert and the advice you're sharing. And that is a theme that is going to come up a lot in the feedback I have for this, is we have to always be thinking about how can we not just give good, useful advice, but how can we do it in a way that is credible, that will lead people to believe in that advice as well.
Ryan McCready was on a while back, and he was talking about he has the same sort of pet peeve when it comes to leading with the research, because it's exactly what you said, where it's your opinion is based on this, not this supports your opinion. Just the order of it makes a huge difference in the mind of the reader. Also, Janessa Lance was on where she was talking about it used to be a lot of we used to have that two-way conversation, and now it's first party opinions are actually more valuable now because of that authority.
One of the most useful tools I've ever found for writing introductions is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So this is called like Hegelian dialectic, and it's a really classic like rhetorical framework. But the basic premise is you introduce something by saying, here is the status quo, here is the way the world is, this is my thesis right now. You then point out all the flaws, all the problems with that. The more counterintuitive and contrarian, the better. And then you basically say, here's how I'm going to reconcile these two problems. Here is a new third way that I'm going to introduce, and that is the meat of the article. I think that could potentially work beautifully here and really, really persuasive, because we're basically saying, hey, you already buy software, you know what that process looks like. But actually, for reasons you probably aren't even aware of, this is not optimal. It's probably causing you to alienate your team, not reflect their decisions, choose software that is not fit for purpose. But thankfully, we can help you deal with that. And here's the solution we propose. So it's quite like a subtle change, but I think I use this all the time in anything that I want to be vaguely persuasive, because it's a really simple, really useful framework for structuring an argument, which is fundamentally what we're doing here. We're arguing against this person's status quo, the way they currently buy business software. So this is a cracking film. Big fan of Moana. Love this song as well. I like memes and GIFs, or GIFs, however you want to say it, because I inject a bit of humor, a bit of personality, admit that it's a person talking to another person, and we like funny things. I do feel like in this instance, it's a little bit of a non sequitur, because we're obviously, the connection we're making is we talked about shiny tool syndrome, and this is the shiniest crab in existence. So that, it kind of passes muster as a kind of funny allusion to that. I generally like, if we're going to talk about something like shiny tool syndrome, I would like to make it a bigger deal. I'm not a fan of bringing concepts in passing that we only use for like a sentence or two and then forgetting about them. It's kind of like the idea of Chekhov's gun, where if you go to a play and everyone's talking about the loaded gun on the wall, you then have to fire that gun for it to be satisfying. Everything you bring up, every concept has to be, I think, alluded to, used in a bigger way beyond just, making a clever pun. So potentially we could either make this article about shiny tool syndrome, which would be very valid, or else I would potentially cut that or replace it with something else. But now I want to get into some good stuff. Now, it's very easy to tear down somebody's article because it's easy to be the armchair critic. There's lots of stuff in here that is very, very good, and I think has been done very well. I really, really love that this early on, we've basically said, we're going to show you our process. So we're going to talk through this in a kind of academic, intellectual way, which is fine. But we're going to then do the much more interesting, much more credible thing of showing you how this has actually impacted us in the real world. That is far more interesting. Not many people do that. Not many articles do that. So right from the get-go, that is a fantastic thing to do. And again, like throwing in a few value adds in terms of templates and downloadables, that's another way you can potentially differentiate from what already exists out there. So I really like this. I like the idea of a decision memo. This almost feels like a bit of a coined concept to me, like some kind of pithy catchphrase which the author could have created that is designed to encapsulate the entire argument they want to make. This is so interesting, actually, that I would almost maybe want to make the title something to do with this. Like there's a great stat later on about how Chili Piper, they reckon they saved money through using this decision memo. So potentially like an alternate title we could look at is the decision memo framework that saved us $70,000 in tool buying costs or something. You obviously then have to reconcile that with the keyword if this is keyword targeted, but that's interesting. That's kind of unexpected. And there's a good meaty like hook there that people can share and think about. So I love the decision memo thing. I'd probably talk about that a bit more loudly if I could. Um, this is only a small point, but I like this because this is something that Jimmy Daly actually embedded in my mind when he was editing one of my blog posts. One of the risks of writing is that we basically treat the reader as kind of stupid. And it's really easy for that to creep into writing if we're not careful about it. So, this example, when you have 200 plus people located across 14 time zones, you might not think it's possible to make fully transparent and inclusive decisions. You'd be wrong. And the issue with that is, I feel like nobody that's buying software would read that and identify with feeling that way. We'd probably, we're not going to think it's an impossible thing to do. That's just a little bit too simplistic. So we just want to be a little bit careful with the language where we're basically erecting a barrier between us, the writer, the person that should be advocating for the reader, and the person actually reading this and trying to learn from us and trying to trust our advice. We don't want to slip into this terrain of telling them that they're wrong, they're stupid. This is really obvious and simple. Why didn't you know how to do this? Because none of these things are simple or obvious. They're all hard to different degrees.
How would you recommend rephrasing a line like that? Because there is a fine line between educating and talking down to the reader.
A really good device is talking about yourself instead of the reader. So you could say, like, in our process of buying software, we thought it was impossible to make fully transparent and inclusive decisions, because you're getting the
Mm.
same core point across, but you are not implicating the reader and suggesting that they're the one that did the silly thing. You're doing the very humble and satisfying thing of saying, I'm a bit of a doofus. I learned how to fix it. You can benefit from my mistake.
I like that. It takes a lot more ownership, and that's some very excellent advice. Thank you.
I really like this. So this is a really cool thing. So throughout this article, they've brought in quotes from their CEO. I think that's a good thing to do, because as much as we would like to pretend we're not swayed by the allure of a fancy CEO title, most people will probably treat the perspectives and feedback of a CEO as more important than a mere humble content marketer like myself. But I think the thing, we could maybe benefit from leaning into this more heavily. So we're basically writing about Chili Piper and about their experience. We're leaning very heavily on their CEO, Nicholas, and his experience. Maybe we should have authored this entire article from him in the first person perspective. Because at the moment, we're kind of inhabiting this nebulous middle ground where we have the almost omniscient narrator that we don't really see. And they're talking about the CEO and about their company in the abstract. It could be much more satisfying potentially if we just have the CEO. We ghostwrite it for them. We say, this is my company. These are my experiences. This is what I learned. You can do the same. And especially if we're writing for a similar audience of like CEOs, executives, founders, that could be a really credible thing to do. And it might just be a little bit more interesting than kind of interspersing quotes throughout, which serve to remind the reader that the person you're holding up as credible is not the person you are reading. It's not the person writing the article. So having a template to accompany this, I think, is really cool. I would probably prefer just to embed it, have it natively within the blog post, have everything we're talking about in one place. One thing I do is I actually embed Google Docs as interactive things you can scroll through within articles. And that can be a great kind of middle ground, because most people probably won't click away. If they do, they're maybe not going to engage with the article in the way you'd hope them to. And actually, the article itself could be much stronger if we're just talking about the thing we're referencing all the time, right in the blog post. So just bring it in, embed it in the article if you can do that.
I like the idea of embedding it too, especially where everybody wants to gate everything now. That might be a good way to segue, or just a quick little tangent on the thoughts of gating versus not gating nowadays.
Yeah. So one of the things Tommy and I was talking about was game theory in content marketing. And I think this is a perfect example. Basically, like, I think content gating is obviously very useful to you, the company, because you get lots of data that you wouldn't otherwise have. But it always, to differing degrees, sucks for the recipient, for the person on the other end. And the only way they will tolerate that is if they have no choice, if they can only get the thing they want through gating. And in content marketing, that's not normally the case. As soon as another company is willing to offer something similar or more valuable to what you're offering, and they're willing to ungate it, you basically lose there. So you have to kind of consider the game theory aspect of this. Your decision should also be motivated by what other companies are doing. And I think as soon as one company ungates, it's almost like the floodgates open and the the trend is set. Like most companies should probably ungate in that situation. Maybe the only way around that is if you have something so valuable and so unique that they can't get it anywhere else, like some kind of proprietary report or something like that. But otherwise, yeah, I'm probably more a fan of ungating content, I think.
I've seen a lot more too of what would typically be hidden behind a gate. Now, it's a small little bit of skin in the game where it's like, charge you $1 or $5 or whatever. And it's because you're not just going to end up being an email. Like, we already know that by gating this thing, you're going to use my email address to send me an autoresponder sequence to blah, blah, blah. Like, we already know that. That's already going to be the case. But if you give me, if I pay you $5, I might spend a lot more time having some investment in whatever it is that you're creating. So, yeah.
I like that. It forces companies to actually put something out into the world that is worth $5, and yeah, that's a good thought to have. I think.
Yeah. I was reading something else recently too, where the person had said, think about what you can get in exchange for an email address nowadays. You can get like a Notion account or an Airtable account or like all of these different software. So why would I sign up for your crappy ebook? Like,
Yeah, that PDF's not going to cut it, is it?
right, right. So the value exchange has to be a little bit more now, is what I'm getting at. All right. Anyways, moving on.
Awesome. So we've done a lot of quite granular line edits, but some bigger picture kind of macro feedback here. Uh, so these sections, for one thing, these headers, they're just very, very boring. Um, they kind of have this dual problem of uh, both being very predictable, like working out how I'm going to buy software. I probably know that I should have to explain the problem or make the business case. Like that's not novel to me, and they're also articulated in such a generic way that it just makes my brain snooze immediately. Um, and we're getting into one of my favorite editing concepts, which is weasel words and weasel phrases. Because as a writer, and arguably the better the writer you are, the easier it is to write sentences that sound very convincing, very fluid, and they say absolutely nothing of merit. And that is exactly the case with things like make the business case, explain the problem, answer questions. The thing that is much more credible than that is actually like, I want to see an example of the kind of problem I would have to solve as part of this process. Don't talk in the abstract. Don't talk about generalizable things. Prove to me that you know this and you can give me the concrete advice. Tell me an example of the problem that I need to solve. Like anytime you buy a tool, you want to make sure it does one of the following. Make sure it increases revenue. I mean, yeah, duh, for one thing. Also, how do I do that? What is the actual mechanical process I need to go through to do that? There's a lot smuggled into that. We could probably write a blog post about how to make sure your new software increases revenue. It's one of those things that sounds helpful, but actually, as soon as you interrogate it, this is the kind of thing that adds very little value, and the reader's probably going to gloss over and not learn very much from. Yeah, do some deep thinking. There's a lot smuggled into that. What kind of deep thinking should I do? Can you give me 3 examples of the kind of things I should be thinking about in order to make this useful to me? And yeah, so there's a bigger issue here, which is this article is broken into 2 sections. This is the theoretical framework of how to write a decision memo. And then we have the decision memo example, which is where we implement that in practice. This stuff is really good, and this stuff is very generic. So my advice would be, we can make this shorter, more compelling, much punchier by combining these 2. They don't need to be separate. I think if we want to talk about how you can solicit recommendations, talk about how you did that at Chili Piper and make it as concrete as possible. We don't need to have the intellectual argument separate from the practical real world example. They are 2 halves of the same thing. It's the real world example that gives the intellectual argument its validity and its credibility. So I would smush these together. That would be my single biggest editing bit of feedback here, is do not have these as 2 sections. These should be 1 section. Yeah, like this is good. this is tangible. Like seeing how a real company has actually benefited from this in the real world is what gives this article actual weight and benefit to it.
When you would give feedback to somebody about that, because from a structural perspective, and I know I've had this issue before, sometimes it feels like the only way to structure an argument is to have that sort of here's the practical, and then here's the application. What's some advice you would give to have a better integration between those two types of things, either using this as a specific example or more broadly speaking?
Yeah, I love that. I don't think it has to be too complicated. What I try and do in a lot of Animalz content is I open by sharing like, here is the overarching framework that I want you to understand, and I go, here is an example of that being implemented into the real world. It feels like a very natural extension of that within the same paragraph. So with all of these, like identify stakeholders, it's good to have this generic framework, but then we could then say, so when we did this at Chili Piper, the people we found to be owners, contributors, and decision makers were X, Y, and Z. And just, yeah, integrate those two. I don't think it has to be particularly complicated. Like they naturally should flow to one another.
Okay. Excellent. Do we have are there any more edits to walk through here?
Yeah, and a couple of very quick ones, I think. So this is a minor thing, but this is a useful thing to have in mind. So it says here, if you grabbed your copy of the decision memo above, you'll notice the template is a bit different from our example. And whilst that's probably true, I think what we've done is basically undermine the value of having a template, because what good really is a template that has to be changed every single time. Like a template should be a template. It should be something you can use in the same format in different instances. So just, it's a valid point and something to talk about, but maybe don't frame it in a way that makes my skeptical brain go like, well, how good is this template? Is this basically just like the one situational process that worked for this one company? How applicable is it going to be to me?
Fantastic. And we have this last one here.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about this. So actually there's somewhere down here, where was it? This is great. They basically say we used this decision memo. It saved us $70,000. I don't know why that isn't one of the very first things we open with. To your point earlier, like basically, here is a framework. This framework saved us $70,000 is basically the most compelling thing you could possibly say in the introduction of any article. So don't bury that. Don't leave it like 3/4 of the way through the article. Yeah, let's open with that straight away and make sure people understand that not only is this a good framework, it's something that actually works and it could save you lots of money.
That's wonderful. I think what's interesting is I was reading recently that the average human reading speed is about 238 words per minute. And that's super important for any type of introduction because most of the time, the first 2 to 500 words are, eh, you gotta hook them. So I think including that further up in the page would be a very valuable idea.
A really fun exercise for that is to think, assume the reader will only read your introduction. How can you deliver as much value to them as possible within that introduction? And I love using that as like a judgment, as a challenge for people.
Yeah. Nikita in the audience here says, curious, how do you balance producing creative, high quality content and keeping up a consistent pace? Is there a case for sacrificing quality to produce more content faster?
Yeah, that is the perennial challenge, I think, of Animalz. We did try this a few months ago where we published less and I spent more time on the ideas. And the average article, it got more engagement, and I found it was more likely to be successful than the average article would otherwise be. But I think not quite enough to merit reducing our publishing frequency. Like it wasn't 2 or 3 times more successful. And I guess one of the benefits of just trying to write as much as you can and maybe not worry about the quality is that you sometimes need to have a few swings at the plate to work out what is going to be the actual good article that will come out of it. So yeah, quite a few of the things I published on the blog are okay. They're not amazing, but they planted the seed of like stuff that was much more useful and interesting later in the line. So it's a hard thing to do. If you can solve that problem, I would love to know how.
I'm going to I'm going to jump off of that a little bit here too. What are you doing to keep yourself off the hamster wheel?
Uh, I mean, I'm not
Because
sure I am
there's
at the moment. I feel like my job is to get back on the hamster wheel. Like after taking a bit of time out from blogging, the hardest thing is actually how do I get this consistent ideation like going again? How do I have a constant stream of content? Um, it definitely helps that I get to write about things that I find interesting, which is not always the privilege of content marketers because we have to do whatever our company needs us to do. I'm very lucky that I care about content marketing, and that does make it fun for me.
fantastic. Well, we only have a few more minutes left here. Audience, if you have any other questions to ask along the, or go ahead and ask. While we're doing that, Ryan, if you could just sort of summarize everything we've been talking about, what's the most important to you? And then where are some places that we can find you online?
Summarize, I'd probably say if you're going to spend a bit of extra time in your life as a content marketer, try and spend it on ideation, trying to come up with slightly stronger, more interesting, more controversial ideas, and worry less about the kind of discrete processes of like keyword optimization and that kind of thing. We know how to do that. Do the harder thing, and you'll probably get better results out of it. Yeah, obviously the Animalz blog. We're in the process of relaunching the Animalz podcast as well. A whole big change to that format, so we're really excited about that. So if you aren't already subscribed to that, I would love you to come hang with us there. And otherwise, I spend way too much time on Twitter and LinkedIn as well.
Fantastic. And we will be putting all of that in the comments here. Thank you so much, Ryan, for your time. I really appreciate it. If you are unfamiliar with the show, or if you would like to sign up for future episodes, go to thecontentstudio.com/the cutting room. And within the next few weeks, we will also be having some excellent guests on from Winter, Asana, and a bunch of other great companies. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of the day.